This story began years ago in the quiet town of Kalamanka, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. Back then, I was just another fresh college graduate, full of wild ideas and a thirst for adventure. Life in Kalamanka was simple, almost dull, until Dennis appeared. He was a man of mystery. He moved into the nicest apartment in town, for rooms, state-of-the-art furnishings, and a garage with a sleek car parked inside. He lived like royalty, but never seemed to work. Every week, we'd see him strolling out of the local grocery store, lottery ticket in hand, grinning as if he knew something we didn't. He's got to be a smuggler or something. My friend Alonzo would speculate as we watched Dennis from the corner diner. Nobody wins that many scratch-offs. I shrug it off. Some people are just lucky, I thought. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Until the night Dennis knocked on my door. It was past midnight, and I'd been dozing off on the couch when the doorbell jolted me awake. Rubbing my eyes, I opened the door to find Dennis standing there, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "John," he said quietly, "can we talk? I need to get something off my chest." I hesitated, but there was something desperate in his expression. I stepped aside, and he slipped into the kitchen. "Beer?" I asked, trying to fill the awkward silence. "Sure," he replied, though his voice sounded distant. As I placed the steaming mugs on the table, Dennis leaned forward, his hands trembling. "John," he began, "what I'm about to tell you, you can't share with anyone." Years ago, Dennis explained, he and two friends, Victor and Harry, had decided to try their luck at prospecting. They'd heard rumors of abandoned gold mines in the rugged woods of northern Kalamanka. Armed with shovels, a few maps, and more confidence than sense, they set off to make their fortune. Most of the sites were picked clean, Dennis said, staring into his untouched tea. For one night, we met an old man around a campfire. He told us about a place deep in the mountains, a crevice called Hollow Sastodian. Plenty of gold there, he said, but nobody who goes in ever comes out. Victor, the boldest in the group, laughed off the warning. Old stories to scare the faint-hearted, he had said. They convinced the man to guide them to Hollow's Astodian, promising him a hefty share of whatever they found. The next day, they reached the Hollow, a desolate canyon flanked by jagged cliffs. The old man stopped at the edge and refused to go further. "Stick to the right crevice," he warned. "There's a spring there, and maybe you'll find something. But don't go near the left crevice. It's a burial ground, cursed by the souls of those who died there. And whatever you do, stay away from the river. The old believers guard those waters, and they don't take kindly to outsiders." The trio laughed it off and set to work. The sun blazed overhead as they dug and sifted through the dirt. Hours passed, and their spirits began to wane. "We've been duped," Harry muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. As the shadows grew long, Dennis noticed a faint golden glow emanating from the left crevice. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice trembling with excitement. Victor and Harry turned, their eyes widening. Without a word, they grabbed their tools and headed toward the light. As they entered the crevice, a chilling wind swept through the canyon, carrying with it a low, mournful sigh. It's just the wind," Victor said, though his voice wavered. The glow grew brighter, and the men dug furiously at the shimmering soil. Dennis hesitated, a gnawing sense of dread creeping up his spine. Suddenly, the ground beneath them quaked, and a deep, resonant voice echoed through the canyon. "What do you seek?" it boomed. The three men froze, their tools clattering to the ground. "Gold, Victor Steinmeret. We're just looking for gold. And what will you trade for it?" the voice asked, its tone both seductive and menacing. Dennis felt an icy hand brush against his shoulder, though when he turned, no one was there. "What do you mean?" Harry whispered, his face pale. The voice chuckled darkly. "Everything has a price." Dennis felt compelled to speak. "What do you want from us?" "Your choices," the voice replied. "Name your desire and accept the cost." In the silence that followed, Dennis heard himself say, "Money, enough to last a lifetime." The voice was quiet for a moment. Then it spoke again, softer this time. "Agreed, but a lifetime is shorter than you think." The next morning, the old man found them huddled near the hollow's entrance, their faces ashen. He didn't ask what had happened, and they didn't offer an explanation. Within weeks, Dennis's life began to change. He found himself winning lotteries, discovering cash on the street, and inheriting unexpected fortunes. He invested wisely, amassing wealth beyond his wildest dreams. But his friends weren't so lucky. Victor drowned in a freak accident, and Harry disappeared without a trace. Dennis, now 42, felt the weight of the deal he'd made. "I've had everything I ever wanted," he told me, "but it's all meaningless. No family, no love, just emptiness." That morning, Dennis left my house, his eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and hope. The next day, I saw police cars outside his apartment. Curious, I approached a neighbor who whispered they found him dead. Heart attack, they think, but I knew better. Hollow's custodian had claimed its price. After Dennis's death, I couldn't stop thinking about his story. Hollow's custodian, the gold, the voice that demanded choices. It all felt too vivid, too real to dismiss as a dying man's ramblings. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I spent days scouring the internet for any mention of Hollow's custodian. Stories of prospectors, disappearances, and strange occurrences piled up like firewood in my browser tabs. The most chilling detail was a legend about an ancient spirit, Whaler, known as the Keeper of Desire. Whaler, they said, was bound to the land by an ancient curse. He offered wealth, power, or love, but his gifts always came at a devastating cost. The stories lined up too well with Dennis's account to be a coincidence. I couldn't go to Hollow's custodian alone. The memory of Dennis's warning was too fresh. Reluctantly, I reached out to Alonzo and another friend, Elliot, a geology graduate who loved exploring the mountains. I know this sounds crazy. I began as we sat in the Salamanca diner, the same spot where we used to gossip about Dennis. But I think Dennis's story was real, and I think we need to see Hollow's custodian for ourselves. Alonzo raised an eyebrow. "You want to chase after a ghost story? What's the end game here?" Elliot leaned forward, intrigued. "What if he's right, Alonzo? If there's even a chance there's gold or something supernatural? Don't you want to see it?" Alonzo sighed. "Fine, but if I end up cursed, I'm haunting you first." The three of us set out early the next morning, armed with camping gear, maps, and a healthy dose of skepticism. As we hiked deeper into the wilderness, the landscape grew more rugged, the air heavier. By the time we reached Hollow's custodian, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the canyon. Elliot was the first to speak. "This place, it feels alive, more like dead," Alonzo muttered, but even he couldn't hide his unease. We set up camp near the edge of the canyon, too nervous to descend before dark. As the fire crackled, I recounted Dennis's tale in full. And then he said, "Everything has a price," I finished. Elliot shivered. "What do you think it means?" I said slowly, "It means we should be careful what we wish for." The next morning, we ventured into Hollow's custodian. Following Dennis's account, we steered clear of the left crevice and the river, sticking to the right as the old man had instructed. Hours passed with no sign of gold or anything unusual. Just rocks, dust, and the occasional eerie gust of wind. "This is a waste of time," Alonzo grumbled, kicking a loose stone. But then Elliot froze. "Do you hear that?" We listened. At first, it was faint, a low hum like distant machinery. As we followed the sound, it grew louder, more distinct, until we realized it wasn't machinery at all. It was a voice. "Seek, and you shall find," it whispered, each word echoing as if spoken into a canyon. "Okay, I'm officially creeped out," Alonzo said, his bravado fading. "Let's keep moving," I urged, though my heart was pounding. The voice led us to a shimmering pool nestled in a narrow alcove. The water glowed faintly, its surface rippling despite the still air. Elliot knelt beside it, entranced. "It's beautiful." As she reached out to touch it, a shadow fell across the pool. A deep, Resonant voice boomed. Do you seek what lies beneath? We spun around, but the canyon was empty. Who's there? I called, my voice trembling. You have come seeking fortune. But what will you trade? Elliot stood, her hand trembling. What do you mean, trade? Everything has a price, Whaler said. Do you dare to name your desire? For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Alonzo, ever the skeptic, stepped forward. If you're real, he said, prove it. Show us the gold. The canyon trembled, and the water in the pool swirled violently. When it stilled, the bottom gleamed with golden nuggets. Elliot gasped. It's real. Whaler chuckled. The gold is yours for a price. And what's that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Your freedom, Whaler replied. Each choice binds you closer to me. Choose wisely. Ellie wanted to stay and dig, but Alonzo and I convinced her to leave. As we climbed out of the canyon, I felt Whaler's presence lingering, his voice echoing in my mind. You cannot escape me, John. You have already chosen. That night, back at camp, Elliot confided in me. What if her curse now? What if just being there was enough? I had no answers, only a growing sense of dread. In the weeks that followed, strange things began happening. Alonzo started having vivid nightmares about the canyon. Elliot's once steady hands began trembling uncontrollably, forcing her to abandon her fieldwork. And me? I started hearing Whaler's voice everywhere. In the wind, the hum of the refrigerator, even the static on the radio. You have chosen, he would say, and you will pay. Desperate for answers, I returned to Hollow's Custodian alone. This time I ventured into the left crevice. The air was thick and suffocating, the walls adorned with strange, glowing symbols. At the end of a tunnel, I found a cavern, its center dominated by a towering, shadowy figure. Whaler, I whispered. You return, he said, his voice dripping with triumph. On Indus, I said. I want my freedom. I chose to stay. What followed was not a battle, but a reckoning. Whaler forced me to confront every selfish decision I'd ever made, every moment of greed, every time I'd taken the easy way out. By the time I stumbled out of Hollow's Custodian, I was a changed man. The gold was never the prize. It was the lesson Whaler had been teaching all along. Back in Salamanca, I shared my story with anyone who would listen. Some believed me, others didn't. But one thing was certain. I never heard Whaler's voice again. Hollow's Custodian remains untouched, a place of mystery and danger. And though I'm free, I'll never forget the price of my choices. The days after my return to Salamanca were quieter, but not in the comforting way I had hoped. I stopped hearing Whaler's voice, but it didn't feel like freedom. Instead, a heaviness settled over me, a creeping sense that I'd left something unfinished in Hollow's Custodian. Alonzo wasn't faring any better. He called me one night, his voice frantic. John, I don't know what's happening, but I can't sleep. I keep seeing that pole in my dreams, and something's pulling me toward it. Don't go back, I said quickly. Whatever it is, it's not worth it. But Alonzo just sighed. You don't get it. It's like I don't have a choice. Elliot had all but disappeared, ignoring my texts and calls. When I finally stopped by her apartment, she didn't even answer the door. Through the window, I saw her pacing the living room, muttering to herself. She looked haunted, her once bright eyes now dull and sunken. One evening, as I sat staring at a map of the region, there was a knock at my door. A tall man in his 60s stood there, his face weathered and lined, wearing a worn-out ranger's uniform. You're John, right? He asked, his voice gruff but kind. Name's Carter. I heard about what happened with Dennis. I nodded warily, gesturing for him to come in. Carter wasted no time. I've been tracking strange events in Hollow's Custodian for years. Disappearances, accidents, people coming back changed. You're not the first to tangle with Whaler, and you won't be the last. Why are you here? I asked. To warn you, he said. Whaler's influence doesn't end when you leave. He finds ways to weave himself into your life, your choices. You need to sever the connection before it's too late. Doubt, I demanded, desperate. Carter hesitated. It won't be easy. Whaler thrives on unresolved desires. You have to confront him again, But this time, on your own terms. Before I could act on Carter's advice, Elliot showed up at my place, looking disheveled. "John, I think I'm losing my mind." She held out her hands, which were trembling uncontrollably. "I can't work. I can't sleep. And the worst part? I keep hearing his voice. He's telling me there's more, that I just have to go back and take it." I tried to reassure her, but it was clear she was barely holding on. The next day, Alonzo called again. "I'm heading back to the Hollow," he said abruptly. "No, you're not," I shot back. "You'll get yourself killed. In nurse." But he hung up before I could say more. Carter insisted on coming with me when I decided to return to Hollow's Custodian to stop Alonzo. "You'll need someone who knows the land," he said. We set out before dawn, trekking through the dense woods until the familiar cliffs of Hollow's Custodian loomed before us. The air was thick, and the canyon seemed even more foreboding than before. "Stay close," Carter warned as we descended into the depths. We found Alonzo near the shimmering pool, his eyes fixed on its golden glow. "Alonzo," I called, but he didn't turn. As we approached, Whaler's voice boomed from the shadows. "You cannot save him, John. He has made his choice." "Alonzo, listen to me," I shouted, grabbing his arm. "This isn't real. The gold, the power, it's all a trap." Alonzo finally looked at me, his expression vacant. "It's not a trap, John. It's a promise. I just have to give him what he wants." "And what is that?" Carter demanded, his voice steady. Alonzo hesitated, then whispered, "My loyalty." Before I could stop him, Alonzo plunged his hand into the pool, pulling out a fistful of gold. The canyon trembled, and Whaler's shadowy form emerged, towering over us. "You have chosen," Whaler intoned. "No," I yelled. "This ends now." Whaler turned his gaze to me. "You cannot break what has been bound, John. But I will offer you one last choice. Leave, and I will release them. Stay, and you will take their place." Elliot stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Don't listen to him, John. He's lying." Carter held his ground, his hand on his rifle. "He doesn't have the power he claims," he said. "Stand your ground." I took a deep breath, my mind racing. If I stayed, I might never escape. But if I left, Alonzo and Elliot would be lost. "Whaler," I said, my voice steady, "I choose to end this. No more bargains, no more deals. You have no power over us." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the shadow began to shrink, its edges fraying like smoke in the wind. Whaler let out a roar of rage. "You dare defy me?" "Yes," I said firmly. The canyon went still, and the shimmering pool faded to a dull, lifeless gray. Alonzo collapsed to the ground, the gold slipping from his fingers and crumbling to dust. Elliot and Carter helped me carry him back to the surface. As we emerged from Hollow's Custodian, the oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt free. Alonzo recovered slowly, though he never spoke of what he'd seen. Elliot quit her field work and moved to a quieter town. As for Carter, he returned to his ranger duties, though he occasionally checked in on me. I never returned to Hollow's Custodian, but its shadow lingers in my mind. I often wonder if Whaler is truly gone, or if he's simply waiting for the next soul to wander into his trap. The gold, the power, the promises, they were never real. The only thing Whaler ever truly offered was a mirror, forcing us to confront our own desires and weaknesses. Elliot moved away entirely. She sent me a short email. "I need distance, John. From everything." I couldn't blame her. If I could, I would have left Colomaica too, but something tethered me here. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the faint pull of Whaler's unfinished business. Alonzo, on the other hand, was struggling. Despite his recovery, he often lapsed into silences that stretched for hours. One night, I found him at my door, trembling. "He's still in my head," he whispered. "I can feel him watching." "Whaler?" I asked. Alonzo nodded. Or maybe it's just a memory. Either way, I can't escape him. Carter visited me regularly, checking in as if he knew the burden I carried. One evening, he showed up with a map of Hollow's Custodian. "I've been doing some digging," he said, spreading the map across my kitchen table. There are reports of strange activity in this area dating back centuries. Even before the town was founded, the native tribes avoided it. They called it the wound that never heals. I frowned. What do you think Whaler really is? Carter leaned back, his expression thoughtful. A trickster, maybe, or a shadow of something ancient. Whatever he is, he feeds on ambition and despair. Hollow Custodian is his hunting ground, and anyone who steps in becomes prey. His words sent a chill through me. So, what do we do? Destroying the place. Carter shook his head. You can't destroy something like that. But there might be a way to seal it. Cut off his influence so he can't reach anyone else. Determined to find a way to end Whaler's hold, I began researching Kalamaika's history. I spent hours in the town library, poring over old records and forgotten lore. One book caught my attention, Whispers in the Hollow. It was a collection of first-hand accounts from people who had encountered strange phenomena near Hollow's Custodian. One passage stood out. The only way to silence the voice is to return what was taken. Only then will the wound begin to close. What does that mean? I muttered, frustrated. Elliot surprised me with a call that night. John, I think I found something, she said. You're not the only one digging into this. There's a woman in town, Freya Bell, who claims her grandfather survived an encounter with Whaler. Freya lived in a small, ivy-covered house at the edge of town. She was in her 80s, her hands frail, but her eyes sharp. When we explained why we had come, she nodded knowingly. My grandfather used to talk about Hollow Custodian, she said. So it almost claimed him, just like it claimed so many others. But he survived because he gave it back. Gave what back? Elliot asked. Freya reached for a small wooden box on her mantel. Inside was a rusted gold coin. This, she said. I stared at it. That came from the pool? She nodded. He took it, thinking it would change his life. But it only brought misery. Whaler tormented him until he returned it. After that, the voices stopped. Alonzo wasn't thrilled when I told him we needed to return to the Hollow. You're insane, John. We barely made it out alive last time. Do you want this to end or not? I snapped. Eventually, he agreed, though reluctantly. Elliot joined us too, saying she couldn't walk away without knowing the truth. Carter, of course, insisted on coming along. We carried the coin Freya had given us, hoping it would serve as a key to whatever ritual we needed to perform. Hollow Custodian was even more oppressive the second time. The air felt sicker, the shadows deeper. As we approached the pool, I felt Whaler's presence growing stronger. You return, his voice echoed, dripping with amusement. Have you learned? This is my domain. Carter stepped forward, holding the coin high. We're here to end this. Whaler's form emerged from the darkness, towering and menacing. Fools, he snarled. You cannot end what you do not understand. Elliot whispered to me. What do we do now? I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the pool. You feed on what we take, I said, holding the coin. So, we're giving it back. The moment I dropped the coin into the water, the pool shimmered violently, its golden hue darkening to black. Whaler roared, his form flickering like a dying flame. This isn't over, he hissed. You cannot silence me forever. As the echoes of Whaler's voice faded, the canyon grew eerily quiet. The pool lost its glow entirely, becoming a still, lifeless expanse. Carter nodded. I think we did it, but I wasn't so sure. Back in Kalamaika, life slowly returned to normal. Elliot decided to stay in town, saying she felt safer knowing the Hollow was no longer a threat. Alonzo began seeing a therapist, working through the trauma he had buried for so long. As for me, I still dream of Hollow Custodian. Not often, but enough to remind me that some wounds never fully heal. Freya's words echo in my mind. You can silence the voice, but you can't erase it. I don't know if Whaler is truly gone. Maybe one day, someone else will wander into the Hollow, lured by its promises. But for now, Kalamaika feels just a little brighter. And that's enough for me.